Let me begin by wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. Do you remember? Do you remember about 7 years ago I came, I said, they're going to be saying Merry Christmas again. They say Merry Christmas now, at least. And it's very important. That was a big deal, and now nobody even thinks about it. We say Merry Christmas. I'm honored by that. When Joe Biden lit the national Christmas tree earlier this month, he completely failed to even mention the birth of Jesus Christ, which is hard to do if you're celebrating Christmas, right? He didn't mention Jesus Christ in his remarks. Not for 3 years he hasn't mentioned that, and barely mentioned God. When I was president, we brought back the beautiful phrase, Merry Christmas, and I said I'd do that. I'm very proud of that, actually, because as I said at the beginning, that was really under siege. And when I lit the Christmas tree each year, it was my honor to publicly celebrate the true source of Christmas joy, which is Jesus Christ.
Question: what kind of bear is best?
That's a ridiculous question.
False. Black bear. Fact: bears eat beets.
Oh.
Bears beets Battlestar Galactica.
Bears do not.
Yeah, Bob. You remember Bob, the guy that's gonna launch a nuclear attack? You got any more abuse you want to hurl my way? Or are you ready to go in here and take care of Bob?
What do you propose, Bob?
When in doubt, C4.
if you didn't already know, it's been Christmas. So this is still the Christmas week. Hey, Tracy, how's it going? And today's actually a pretty unique day as well, because one of my all-time favorite people in this world, the inventor of Linux, Linus Torvalds, is his birthday today. And I thought, what better way to... Yeah, you may have to turn me up. It's a little bit... I can try turning up a little bit, but it's a little bit different in Linux. I am about as loud as I think I can get this. Anyway... I thought, what better way than to talk about Linux and what it is and exactly what's involved at. Well, get ready to be muted then. Sorry. I haven't worked out all the bugs yet. I worked with it last night. Everything sounded okay, but as usual, it's hard to determine how it's actually going to sound on your end, because, well, just because it sounds great on my end doesn't mean it's necessarily going to sound good on somebody else's end. Anyway, and that part I have no control over. You're going to have to control that. Anyway, I've got my iced coffee. Speaking of which, sip them if you got them. And let's get switched over here so we can dive into talking about what is Linux and how it became a thing and how and why and who Linus Torvalds is and why he created Linux and so forth. But before we get into that, let's find out a little bit about what Linux is. Linux, according to Wikipedia, is a family of open source Unix-like operating systems based on the Linux kernel. An operating system kernel, and let me zoom in here. Really? Yeah, see, that may be YouTube messing with you there, Tracy. Sorry, I can't control that because I didn't do anything different. Anyway, let's, if, for those of you that don't know me very well, one of the reasons why I'm a penguin is I like Linux. And there is a picture of Tux. That is the official, unofficial mascot of Linux. A powerful, flightless bird. There we go. Anyway, Linux was a Unix-like operating system that's based on the Linux kernel created by a guy named Linus Torvalds. As a matter of fact, most people don't realize this or not, but Linux is pretty much everywhere. You just don't see a lot of it. If by some chance you happen to have an Android device, you're running Linux. Your phone's running Linux, or your tablet's running Linux, because Android is a version of Linux created by Google. Actually, it was actually bought by Google and modified. Because there was a company that was producing Android. Chromebooks are running a version of Linux, because that's what Chrome OS is. Chrome OS is a version of Linux. It is everywhere in embedded systems, everything from routers to automation controls to smart home devices, video game consoles. Matter of fact, Most people don't realize this, but if you own a PlayStation, the operating system that's on a PlayStation is based off, it used to be a version of Linux. What I don't know is now with PS5, whether or not that version of operating system that Sony put on there is still Linux or if it's still their own. Either way, it's running a version of Linux or a version of the kernel Linux. Television. A lot of smart televisions are running Linux. A Roku, if you know what a Roku device is, or a Chromecast, those are also another devices running Linux. Smart watches, with the exception of an Apple Watch. I'm talking anything here that's not a Apple device. Outside of that, like a smartwatch, is running a version of Linux. Operating systems inside automobiles even run Linux. The International Space Station and a lot of controls and devices controlled on the International Space Station, as well as even in the Space Shuttle, are running Linux. Even Falcon 9 by Tesla and Elon Musk is in the Dragon capsule are running Linux. The Perseverance rover that went and landed on Mars from NASA is running a version of Linux. Most people don't realize just how much Linux is a part of your day-to-day life. Why? Because it always seems to be behind the scenes. But there is just a lot to this operating system. Let's talk about the guy that created it. Linus Torvalds. Now, he is a Finnish-born American. Last I checked, I think he lives out in like Oregon or someplace. Used to be around in Silicon Valley out in California some. But he is the inventor of the very first Linux kernel, which actually he owns the rights to the Linux kernel, even though operating systems like, say, for example, Windows or Mac OS X are what's called copyrighted operating systems. Linux is considered to be what's called a copylefted, which means it's open source. Apple and Windows, for example, does not give you the code they use to create the operating system. Linux, being open source, does. So you can actually make a version of Linux your own. And years ago, I was actually working on making my own version of Linux. I just kind of got bored with it and moved on. Plus, it's extremely complicated to get all that stuff working with the Linux kernel. But the kernel itself is developed only by one person, Linus Torvalds. The kernel, if you don't understand what a kernel is, every operating system has it. It is the heart and soul of the operating system. It is what accepts commands from you as the user. Anything you do inside of an operating system eventually gets routed to the kernel, and that kernel then routes that information to the BIOS that controls the hardware inside your computer. So, for example, if you're playing a video on YouTube, you click on that in a web browser, the operating system is eventually sending all that information down to the operating system level at the kernel, and the kernel is then translating that and sending that back out to the BIOS so that sound comes out of your sound card and out to your speakers or your headphones or whatever you're using. So you actually hear it. Same way with going to the graphics card. Everything runs through the kernel. It is the operating system. Without the kernel, the operating system would not function. Matter of fact, if you found a way to delete the kernel, the operating system no longer works. All talk about kernel reminds me of Colonel Sanders, and now you want fried chicken? You're funny, Tracy. Anyway, Now you're making me hungry too. Maybe I'll go grab something after this. I still got Christmas ham though. So anyway, this is Linus Torvalds, and today's his actually birthday. He turns 54, so he's a Gen Xer as well. He grew up in the same generation as I did, and yeah, you're very trying, Tracy. I'm just kidding. Anyway, he was born in Helsinki, Finland, to the son of Anna and Nils Torvalds. And he basically ended up being by necessity, a software engineer that developed a version of Unix that he could use while he was at university. Yeah, Tracy, you're just barely Gen X as well. I get that. Anyway, let's dive into a little bit more what Linux really is. So, on Linux.com, it describes in detail a little bit about what Linux is. So what is Linux? Looking to get started, it's from everything from smartphones to cars, supercomputers and home appliances, home desktops to enterprise servers. Linux operating system is everywhere. Matter of fact, most people don't realize it, but when you type in http://www.google.com, that is a Unix command. It's a Unix protocol. Based off of a networking protocol called TCP/IP, which is made by Unix or POSIX compliant operating systems, and the vast majority of web servers are running a version of Linux. Now, when you go look at a web page, like say for example, when I'm looking at Linux.com right here, I'm actually looking at the information and files and pictures and everything that's being provided to me from the web server across the internet to my web browser. That interaction is between my computer and a Linux server. So you have contact every single day. The average person has no clue just how much contact they have every single day with Linux. Without Linux, our current internet infrastructure and devices and stuff we do, our daily lives would be 100% affected. So it's that important, and but it's kind of like the unsung hero that really nobody knows because it kind of resides in the background. Linux has been around since the mid-1990s, 1991 to be precise. It has since reached a user base that spans the globe. Linux is actually everywhere, and actually, believe it or not, America is one of the few countries that the main operating system is Windows. The rest of the world, especially Europe, their main operating system, like in China, is Linux. It's in phones, thermostats, your cars, refrigerators, Roku devices, televisions. It runs most of the internet and all the world's top 500 supercomputers and the world's stock exchange even. But besides being the platform of choice to run desktop servers and embedded systems across the globe, Linux is one of the most reliable, secure, and worry-free operating systems currently available. And here's all the information you need to know. Just like Windows, hopefully, let me zoom in a little bit so you can see this a little bit better. Just like Windows, iOS, and Mac OS X, Linux is an operating system. In fact, one of the most popular platforms on the planet. Android is powered by the Linux operating system. An operating system is nothing more than a software that manages all the hardware resources associated with your desktop or laptop. To put it simply, the operating system manages the communication between your software and your hardware. Without the operating system, the software wouldn't function. You couldn't run Word or even this web browser or even OBS I'm running right now, live streaming to you. The Linux operating system comprises of several different pieces. The bootloader, which is what boots up the operating system. The kernel, this is the one piece of the whole that is actually called Linux. The kernel is the core of the system and manages the CPU, memory, and all the hardware in your computer. The kernel is the lowest level of the operating system. And I won't get into a lot of all these other things as well, but the part you're probably most familiar with is the desktop environment. Now, in Windows, that translates to what's called Windows Explorer or File Manager. Is also ties into that. In Linux, that environment is such as called GNOME, Cinnamon, Mate. There's several different desktop environments. It's one of the reasons why I like Linux so much, is because it's extremely versatile to make it look and feel the way you want and do what you want with it. It has a vast array of applications. Pretty much in this day and age, anything you can do in Windows, you can do in Linux. Anything you can do on a Mac, you can do in Linux. It may not be the exact same software, but the software that's available will allow you to still do everything that you are used to doing otherwise. So why use Linux? This is the one question that most people ask. Why bother learning a completely different computing environment when the operating system that ships with most desktops, laptops, and servers works just fine? To answer that question, I would pose another question. Does the operating system you're currently using really work just fine? Or do you find yourself battling obstacles like viruses, malware, slowdowns, crashes, costly repairs, and licensing fees? If you struggle with any of the above, Linux might be the perfect platform for you, because Linux has evolved into one of the most reliable computer ecosystems on the planet. It's also free. It's a free operating system, as in like a free hot dog. Matter of fact, I have a philosophy in life. You could buy a hot dog for $1 and get the exact same hot dog for free, identical, no difference. And I guarantee you the free hot dog tastes better. I don't know why. I think it's because it's free. You didn't pay for it. Everybody likes free. Anyway, so let's get into looking at a little bit about, this is one of my favorite websites right here called distrowatch.com. And DistroWatch is one of the few websites out there that keeps track of all the latest versions of Linux, or what's called flavors or distributions. Matter of fact, if you go down right here, what is a distribution? I'm back on Linux.com. It says Linux has a number of different versions to suit any type of user, from new users to hardcore users. You'll find a flavor of Linux to match your needs. Everything from Linux Mint, which that's a version of Linux like my brother likes. It's because it's geared toward people that are used to using Windows. It's very easy to use. Manjaro is primarily used a lot in Europe. Debian, which is kind of what I use. I use a derivative of Debian called Ubuntu. This is what I'm actually in right now. If you were to actually see my desktop, which let me show it to you real quick. This right here is Linux. This is my primary operating system. It's my operating system of choice. And actually, most people, when they think of Linux, they think of this. A little cursor sitting at a prompt. And that actually is the operating system, because what you're actually seeing with this is just kind of the graphical user interface, or the nice shiny thing that allows you to control this. In contrast with Windows, ever since Windows 95 on up, Windows is the actual graphical part. That is the actual operating system. And to do things at a command level in Windows is very limited. There's some things you cannot do in Windows on the command line that you have to do in the GUI. But that is not the case with Linux. Everything I can do here, I can do here. Because actually, my first exposure to Linux was back in 1995 with a flavor called Slackware. And it didn't have a GUI. There was no graphical user interface at that time. Matter of fact, that right there is the version of my kernel. Actually, that is my kernel right there. It's version 5.17. The first kernel I started playing with was version 1.12. That tells you how long I've been playing with Linux. I've been playing with Linux for a very long time. It is my OS of choice, and it is what I prefer to use on a daily basis if I can. The only exception is with that is and God bless them, Steam or Valve is trying to correct this, is when it comes to video games. Video games are still very much made for one platform and one platform only on a PC, and that's toward Windows. Even Mac users are left out in the cold a lot. So are Linux users. Although Valve, who makes Steam, is actually trying to correct that. Matter of fact, I can show you right here. As soon as it comes up, I have a version of Steam installed because Valve makes a version of Steam for Windows, Mac, and Linux. The problem is not every game I got will play on Linux. Now, this is one of my all-time favorite games called No Man's Sky. And we're going to show you right here. If I go to the store page, most people don't even know this is a thing. They never really pay that close attention. When you buy a game, if you scroll down here, and actually that's cool. It's still on sale for $30 until January 4th. Cool. Anyway, right down here, system requirements. It tells you the operating systems that game's worked for. Notice Linux is not even listed here. But one of the things that I can do in Linux that Valve is really trying to change the game here on is on a game, I can do what's called run a thing called Proton, which Proton allows me to run Windows games in Linux. And actually, some games work really well and some don't. I think, to be honest with you, that's kind of the reason why I feel like Linux has not gone as mainstream as it could be. Although I'm really glad that Valve is really trying to make that a thing. Matter of fact, if you own a Steam Deck, it runs Linux. Steam OS is a version of Linux created by Valve. So let's get back to talking a little bit more about Linux and what it is, and then we're going to hear straight from the horse's mouth today on what Linux is. And It's here. There's some other ones here. Antigross, that's another one that's burst off. These are distributions. I wanted to take an opportunity to show you what my version of Linux looks like. There's several different ones here. Fedora is an open source community driven one originally was made by Red Hat Linux. Red Hat is huge in the server world. The vast majority of servers out there are running a version of Red Hat Linux. Elementary OS, that's a version of Linux that I really like. That one's really geared toward Mac users. It gives you the kind of the Mac OS look and feel. Matter of fact, let me show you what I'm talking about here. On distrowatch.com, if you right here on the right hand side, there are several different versions of Linux that they rank them constantly. They're changing ranks on what's the most popular ones. This is one right here that I run called Ubuntu. And if you look at Ubuntu, here's what a standard install of Ubuntu looks like. Obviously, mine doesn't look like this because I've configured mine to make it look like I want. But that's kind of, if you did a basic install of Ubuntu 23.10, which is the latest version of it, that's what it would look like. Just a standard install. Let me show you Linux Mint, which is one that's very, very popular. Where is it at on the list? There it is. Second one on the list. A lot of people use this one because they come from Windows. They're used to using Windows, and they switch over and play around with Linux. And if you look, that kind of has a Windows look and feel to it, doesn't it? You got the computer, you got your home folder, you got like a little start bar with a logo and everything. Now let me show you the one that looks like Mac. And it's called Elementary OS. It's loading. Takes a little bit, but it's loading. And once again, all these operating systems are all still Linux. They all still run a version of the Linux kernel. It just all the software and the graphical user interface, the desktop basically, are all designed by whoever made that version of Linux and wanted to have their different look and feel to it and so forth. But if you kind of look here, it looks very similar to like what a Mac looks like. Got the little docker down here. Matter of fact, if you saw my version there, I have a little dock on there because I worked for Apple a number of years and I kind of got used to that look and feel. Although I still have a combination of what looks like Linux as well as what reminds me a little bit about Mac. And even some things look a little bit like Windows at times. I have a little hodgepodge of things. Anyway, so let's dive in here and let's hear from the horse's mouth exactly what Linux is, how it came about, and why it is today. This is from a YouTube site called Computer History Museum. I encourage you to check them out. They, if you're ever curious about what exactly the history of computers was, they actually have I believe, a physical location. You could actually go check them out. I don't know where they're at, but they also have various different not websites, but videos up on their YouTube channel that you can watch to learn about computer history. And this is actually a video that was made 15 years ago, recorded in September 19th, 2001. And just so you know, Linux was created September 17th, 1991. So this is like 10 years later after the fact of Linux first being released by Linus Torvalds. Okay? So let's just watch it, and I'll pause it periodically and comment on things.
So I'm supposed to talk about the origins of Linux, and it may feel strange to you that
He looks so young there. Anyway.
it's only been 10 years, and it feels even stranger to me. Also, part of the history of Linux is that I used to give a lot of speeches on Linux. In about 93, I was starting to go to different conferences.
Also, once again, as always, the link to this video is down in the description, and all that information that I had of what Linux is and so forth, I will put those links to those websites in the description as well. Basically Wikipedia and DistroWatch.
A lot of the academic world started noticing that some of their students, for example, sometimes their teachers were actually using Linux, and it was gathering enough interest that I had to go and talk about it. At the same time, I never really liked talking. And one thing that is definitely part of history for Linux is...
He mentioned about Linux being in schools and so forth. That's the other thing. Linux is huge in the education world, K through 12. And even in secondary education, in colleges and so forth. It's massive because it has no overhead. There's no... The cost of Linux primarily is in the cost of supporting it, not the operating system itself. Like, for example, when you have a Windows computer, that version of Windows has a license because it's not free, and you have to buy, if you want to install another version of Windows on another computer, you have to buy another license from Microsoft. You do not have to do that with Linux. And yes, I know maybe somebody out there might be thinking, yeah, but Mac OS is free. Yeah, but if you actually read the software license, you're technically not legally allowed to install Mac OS X on anything else, or actually Mac OS now, Mac OS on anything but an Apple computer. So if you install it on something that's not an Apple, you're actually voiding the copyright license that Apple owns on their operating system. Linux, on the other hand, is copylefted. You can do pretty much anything you want with it, with one exception. You still have to provide the operating system in some free form. And that's because of this man right here, Linus Torvalds, wanted to make a version of Unix that was free for anybody to use forever. And now, does that mean the company like, say, Red Hat or Elementary or Ubuntu has to provide their version of the operating system that they're selling for free? No. They can provide a different version, but they have to offer a version of it somehow for you to download and access. That's part of the GNU public license, the open source license. That's what's so cool about this. Anyway.
This is me giving talks. This is one of the first talks I've been giving in the last 2 years, apart from really small things. So I hope this will be the really last one. So in that sense, maybe this is a historic occasion too.
It's not going to be the last talk he gives.
Because I don't like giving talks that much, I'll have kind of a brief introduction to the real origins of origins of Linux, what kind of made it all happen, what actually happened 10 years ago, and then I'll stop talking and I'll...
Remember, 10 years ago in this video was 1991, when Linux first came about.
Take questions, because questions and answer session can be excuse me, can be a lot more interesting than just talks. And if you don't have questions, then we'll stop early. as far as I'm concerned, yesterday is history. So if you want to talk about the release of 2.4.10 pre-12, then that's okay. But I think that was not what most people had in mind. So anyway,
2.4
that's
kernel. Wow.
About me. I
That's
actually
so
started using computers when I was 11, and I used, you may know, the Commodore VIC-20. They did not have one when I was here a few days ago that they could show to people.
I never owned a Commodore VIC-20, but I played with one. I also played with a Commodore 64. My first computer was a TRS-80 Color Computer 2, running a POSIX Unix-like operating system on it called OS 9, or running BASIC.
And I suspect that in this area, the Apple II is much better.
An
now.
Apple II.
But the VIC-20 a few years later came out.
Boy, it tells you how old this is.
And I got my first computer that way in '81. How many of you actually used a VIC-20? Wow. Okay.
I played with one.
I mean, by some standards, I mean, having had seen the first computer as a VIC-20, I'm not historic at all. There are people here who have seen a lot more interesting machines. But what was interesting was that it was the first machine, at least in Europe, that was, you didn't have to put together, and that was reasonably cheap. And reasonably cheap was important for me and my family. So I started out as a classic geek.
Yeah,
There weren't
baby.
that many games for the VIC.
Power to the geek.
So like probably a large portion of you, I started out programming. On the week you started with BASIC. Fairly quickly you started doing machine code, and I mean machine code because I never really figured out what an assembler was until like 5 years later. So
And believe it or not, I can relate a lot to this man because I started out the same way on BASIC, as well as even learning how to program machine code. And eventually I learned assembly language as well at a later point.
So you had to do the numbers like a real man, right? And
He's talking about hexadecimal, baby!
and I think that when you grow up with that kind of setup, and with machines that are still, I mean, easy enough that you can actually understand the whole machine, you think about computers differently. And maybe to somebody who understood every single vacuum tube in something that only had 16,000 of them thinks that I'm stupid for saying something like that. But I'm convinced that I could understand that machine I started with, and I'm convinced that if I started today, I could not understand the kind of machines that you start with today. It's just too complex. 81 was obviously also the year that the PC was released, and I held a deep disgust for the PC. The VIC-20 had the 6502, the same as in the Apple II, the same as in a lot of these kind of things. And you may remember the deep chasm between the 6502 people and the C80 and the PC people.
If you don't know what he's talking about, a 6502 is a type of processor. Matter of fact, the TRS-80 Color Computer 2 had a 6800, actually a 6809 processor in it that was also a cousin to an Apple II.
So I eventually upgraded my machine, but I didn't upgrade to a PC, but to a Sinclair QL. And I doubt very many of you have actually used the Sinclair QL.
I've used the Sinclair QL as well. I've never owned one, but I played with it.
Even in this kind of crowd. How many of you have ever heard of the name?
Oh, yeah.
A fair number have heard. How many have used it?
Timex Sinclair, baby.
It was a piece of crap, quite frankly.
He's not wrong.
It was a very interesting machine, but it was extremely unstable.
It was.
One of the problems with that machine was that it was only popular in the UK, which meant that in Finland especially, there was no support for it, which meant that even during later times I never had any ready-made programs. I always had to write my own, which kind of explains why I eventually ended up writing my own operating system, because, hey, that was just what you did.
Yep, pretty much.
If I had gotten a sane machine like an Amiga or something like that, I would probably have gotten very used to actually using programs that others wrote. And I never had that possibility, and I was trying to kind of maybe explain some of the background. So you should be happy that most of you haven't used the Sinclair QL, but at the same time, think of what you lost too.
Yeah, so without it, there wouldn't be Linux.
One thing that Sinclair definitely taught me was never ever buy a piece of hardware that is not bog standard, right? I may not like PCs, but actually these days I like PCs, but I decided the next machine I get would be a PC. And happily also the 386 was actually the chip that made PCs acceptable.
Exactly. My first PC was a 386. I owned a 386, I want to say 60 hertz. Not megahertz, hertz. That's how old those are.
Going from this really horrible architecture that was painful in every way, you went to this really strange architecture that you could actually make pleasant, which was a big step. So we skip forward to 1990. I got out of.
Yes, there was a 286, and I've got to see one. Matter of fact, the very first processor in the x86 family is an 8086, and then the next PC came out was an 8088. And then there was an 8186 that didn't really see the light of day. And then the next PC that kind of came out with that processor in the family was a 286. But the one that really started the PC to put it up on the map was a 386. And most people, when they bought a PC, their first introduction was a 386 processor. 286 was not very popular. There was, well, like I said, 186 didn't really have a release. 8086 is really old. That's what's called the XT model, or the PC XT model. I actually had one somewhere that I bought years ago, but nevertheless, more than likely, and I don't know if, Tracy, if you had a 286 or not, but if I had to guess, you probably had a 386 thinking it's a 286, because 286 was not still mainstream at that point. It wasn't until 386 when PC started going mainstream that people that started taking notice that PC was a game changer for the personal computer, for everybody in home and so forth.
Out of the Finnish army, and did not look forward to any kind of physical exercise for the rest of my life. So,
cool.
So I basically.
So basically, you had no hard drives, had a 5.25 inch floppy drive that run the operating system off of it, and you're talking about maybe DOS, either PC DOS 1.1. And MS-DOS didn't exist yet. Okay.
Sat down and started preparing for, as already mentioned, my second year of university. And one thing that happened, you should realize.
Yeah, the only DOS that existed on a PC at that time was PC DOS. And if you're talking in 286, you're probably talking about version 1.1 or maybe 1.1a. I'd have to, it's been so long since I've messed with that. Because 2.1 didn't come out, I believe, until 386s. And that's also when Microsoft DOS started to become a thing.
This is 1990. This is the year before I started writing Linux. I did not know C, and I had never heard of Unix, right? But during the semester of the second year at university.
So your upgrade license for Windows was a 5.25-inch floppy for years and years. I had to make sure I had a working drive. Yeah, you're only talking all the way up to Windows 3.0, I believe. Because 3.1 came out on floppy 3.5-inch floppy disks. Because I still have somewhere, I have a version of Windows 95 that came out on 22 3.5-inch floppy disks. 22 of them. Yeah. Oh, trust me. I know all too well about all of that. That's how I did things as well. I remember playing around with PC DOS. The very first version of DOS I played with was PC DOS version 1.0. And I think the first version of MS DOS may have been 2.1, I think, or 2.2. And there are differences between PC DOS and MS DOS. And back in those days, like I said, until 386, MS DOS was not a thing.
University, one of the courses that was on the curriculum was this course on C and Unix.
And by the way, what's so important about DOS? DOS was based off of Unix. Actually, DOS was a version of Unix that had all the multi-user, all the security, and the multi-threading and all that ripped out of the operating system and gave you access to the command interpreter, which talked directly to the kernel. Unlike Unix, has been doing that for its inception. But it also, Unix has started out as a mainframe operating system first and foremost. And actually, he's going to talk a little bit about some of that.
And to just show how important the timing was, this is actually the first time that the University of Helsinki had a course on C and Unix at all, because the university had been this VAX and VMS place. So they'd had courses on
VAX, VMS, that's a mainframe operating system that is based off of Unix.
And I was convinced that small home computers were pleasant to use, and big monster machines like that
you're not funny!
The devil's invention, right?
With the chicken jokes.
So I did not like big machines at all. But the university had decided that
somebody must be hungry.
they wanted to get on the wave.
You're making me hungry.
And
Stop
they
it.
had a microvax with a 16-user license, and they had a small course in teaching C and Unix.
Oh,
and
microvax,
this is so
too.
new for the university that the person who gave the course had never actually used C or Unix himself. So he actually tried hard, mostly failing, but still, to keep abreast with his students. The one thing that was absolutely incredible about this course was the course literature. I've never had a course where the books are books that I think about 10 years later. And we had 3 books, and we had 3 outstanding books. We had the book on C was obviously KNR. The book on operating systems was Andrew Tannenbaum's Operating System Design and Implementation. And the book on Unix was Maurice Bach's The Design of the Unix Operating System, which is very dated by now, but is still one of the best books on Unix as far as I know, in its dated kind of way. And that was a turning point for me, because suddenly you had this microvax, which is a horribly slow machine, 16 users, and all 16 users were on at the same time, because the course was actually 32 users, and the theory was apparently that, okay, half of them were on in daytime and half of them were on in
Wow.
nighttime, right? And yet, I learned that, okay, I don't actually like microcomputers anymore. What I want to have Unix, right, on my machine at home. And that was kind of a big thing. And it didn't take that long for me to realize that this is actually what I want to use. And,
Is Unix, yeah.
and that is something that really made me convinced about how Unix was just better than everything else. Was that you could kind
Still
of
is,
grasp
baby.
the fundamental ideas fairly quickly. And then there were tons of details, but in the end, the details didn't matter. And that was very unlike, and still is very unlike any other operating system out there.
He's absolutely correct.
And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I still wanted to mention that it was a big thing for me. And the problem was I couldn't get Unix anywhere, right? I don't know about, in this area you probably could. You could probably drive down to Santa Cruz and ask somebody who worked for a CO to give you a copy. But in Finland, it was hard to find Unix for a hobbyist kind of thing. It was probably hard to find it even for a company, but for a hobbyist kind of thing, I went out to the trade shows and tried to find Interactive or SCO or something like that, and I couldn't.
Oh,
So
good
what
old
ended up
SCO
happening
Unix.
was that I bought this PC, which was cheap and standard hardware, which was exactly what I wanted to have, and I got Linux for it and thought that would make me happy. And
I've played with Mini-X too before.
there were two things. A, Linux didn't make me happy.
Nope.
And B, I was playing around with this new piece of exciting hardware. So the 386 is this wondrous beast, and most people who use PCs don't even realize how strange and wonderful a piece of hardware it actually is. Especially when you come from this 68,000 world, and you didn't have memory management because you didn't have a 6830 or anything sane like that. The 386 had everything. It had memory management with both paging and this strange segmentation stuff. It had task switching in hardware. So if you're like geek who's used to programming in machine code or assembly language by now, and you were used to doing everything by hand anyway, the obvious project to do was to just test out every new feature of this computer that you had no idea about. So I had two projects going on at the same time. One of them was I tested out every feature I could find in this book on the 386 by Crawford and Gelsinger. And that included paging, segmentation, included task switching. So I had this small thing that just booted up from real mode, turned into protected mode, which is where all the interesting stuff is going on, enabled paging, treated stuff up to
Real
the
mode
screen
and protected
showed
mode,
that it was
baby.
actually doing task switching by just switching between two tasks that printed out different things. So that was one of my projects, just purely for reading, for trying to teach me myself about the PC. And the other project that happened was because I disliked Linux so much. What ended up being the case is that Linux, that I needed to read news. Everybody here is probably addicted to news groups. I know I was, I still am. And I could not do that from Linux because the terminal emulation was so horribly bad. So I actually wanted to write a terminal emulation package. And these two projects, whoops, well, it's not important anymore. The two projects ended up being what became Linux. It was A, learning about the PC, and B, using what I learned to actually make a terminal emulation package. The task switching ended up being useful because I ended up doing exactly what all Unix terminal emulation packages do. That you have one process that reads from the keyboard and sends to the modem, and the other one that reads from the modem and sends to the screen. I mean, so you use task switching for that. And the interesting things that start happening is when you want to start downloading things and uploading things through your terminal emulation package, and you realize that, I actually need to write stuff to disk. So you need to have a disk driver. You need to understand the file system. In my case, it was Minix that I was using most of the time, except when I was trying to read news. So I needed to have something that decoded and was able to modify the Minix file system. And by this time, it's now June or July in 91, and I realized that I'm actually going to write an operating system. And the fun part is that I'd been wasting my time for like 4 months on just figuring out how protected mode actually worked. And that was the really painful part. And then when I had all the basic...
I can tell you this much from experience. It's one of the reasons why I kind of gave up on making my own flavor of Linux. Trying to understand kernel programming is hard. It's extremely complicated. It's why, to me, it's very impressive that he created his own kernel. That is what we know as Linux today, because it's not a simple, easy task to do.
Basics for it, I had, like just getting a display driver had taken me months. But then protected mode did work. I had all the infrastructure. And from deciding to make an operating system to actually releasing the first version, 0.01, was less than 3 months.
Closed captioning on this is really bad.
Admittedly, 0.01
probably because
was
of his
the best
accent.
OS that ever was. But it was surprising how hard
Maybe,
it was
I
to
don't
get
know.
started. And this is probably why most people don't want to do operating systems, is because when you don't have anything to start with, you don't even see that you're making any progress. You're going one instruction at a time, basically. But then when you get past a certain phase, it actually starts getting much faster. And the only point there's 2 points in Linux development where I was ready to give up. One was when I realized that I had to write a file system and a disk driver. And I had to ask myself, is this really worth it? And the answer was probably no, but at that point, I had nothing better to do. So in a very real sense, that's kind of the reason for Linux. The second point was much later on when Linux, well, not much later on, but by the end of 91, when Linux actually did most of what I wanted to do. And I was getting to the point where, okay, this does everything I envisioned it to do. It actually implemented everything Minix did. And having written myself, I always thought it was much better. And that was the second point where I could have stopped, because that's usually what I'd done earlier with my projects. And the thing that made me not stop then was two things. One was I had released Linux, and there were actually people out there using it. Not very many at that point. But the other thing was that I, by mistake, actually erased my Minix partitions, which, again, I mean, the mistake of erasing my Minix partition meant that suddenly I had no choice but to either spend a lot of time reinstalling Minix and redoing everything I had done to make the system okay, or I could just bite the bullet and say, okay, I will actually fight this until my system is completely self-hosting, and then I will just have to use it. And it was close enough at the time that the mistake actually ended up being what really made the whole system usable. At that point, nobody else was actually using Linux. A lot of people were playing around with it, but there's a large difference between using a system for everyday work and just testing out what somebody else is working on. And by what actually happened was that I had written this auto-dialer script to auto-dial up to the university machines to read news again. And by mistake, Unix devices looking pretty much like any other devices, I actually auto-dialed my Minix partition, which wrote a lot of ATDCs to my hard disks.
Oh, that's great. I didn't remember that part.
But the fact that I auto-dialed my Linux partition was actually what was the second thing that made Linux really, really happen. So you have two things that are really the cause of Linux. One is
He
I
sent
had
a
nothing
bunch
better
of
to
data
do,
that was sent
and
to
I'm a
his
stupid git.
modem instead.
And
He sent it to his partition,
then everything
wiping
else
it
is
all
like
out.
very much details. The reasons I've
Exactly.
continued for 10 years is just that it's been a lot of fun, and especially having people's input and making it available on the net was, I mean, not just from a technical perspective, the best decision in Linux at all. It was also what made it so much fun that it actually became something 5-10 years later.
Yeah, I can't stress this enough. I think him doing this and kind of sending it out there and getting feedback from the community out there has made what Linux is today. I actually wholeheartedly believe that, because unlike Mac and Windows, the Linux community is very supportive of everyone else in that community, and especially to even new users. They're very welcoming. They're very helpful. They go out of their way to come up with solutions that maybe somebody didn't think of, but then they share those solutions with everybody and their brother. One of the reasons why I like Linux so much as opposed to Windows is in my estimation, is so much easier to find a solution for something in Linux than it is sometimes in Windows. Because of the fact that Windows is made by Microsoft, and they kind of keep their stuff when it comes to the core of the operating system close to the vest. So they don't always 100% share everything about the operating system, as opposed to it being free and open source. Anybody that wants to play around with it can. If you want to hook up your Linux computer to burn the weather on your toast in the morning, you can. Matter of fact, years ago, I actually saw a video on that somebody actually did that. They wanted their toaster to be able to burn the daily weather temperature forecast on their toast every morning. And they did that by installing a serial port on their toaster and setting up an embedded computer inside there, running a version of Linux that was tied back to their Linux computer, and they just wrote some code in C to be able to do that. There is so many things out there that you couldn't do that with Windows or Mac OS. And if you did do it, you'd have to get Microsoft involved to get their blessing. And a lot of times they won't give it to you, or they'll give it to you, but they'll charge you for it. That's the difference between closed source and open source. And that's what I love about this. And that's why I think him starting this operating system with it being community driven from the very beginning is why Linux has permeated so much of our world, so to speak, that it has. Because it's taken off like wildfire. It's a grassroots community driven thing that he started. He lit the match and it grew from there.
So that's kind of the real basic background, and that's where I stop and where the questions maybe start.
We'll watch a little bit of the Q&A, and then we'll probably just call it quits for the evening. For the day, because this is an hour and 25-minute video, and we've already seen only 25 minutes of it, which is pretty much him explaining how Linux came about. So to speak, Linux was a thing out of necessity that he was A, bored, B, wanted a version of Unix on his own computer at home in Finland and couldn't get something like that, and Minix wasn't doing it for him, which I can understand that one. And then the happy accidents that came along the way with that, what he was doing, caused him to kind of decide to build the operating system. And then it took off from there. And it's now this massive, really cool thing that I love to play with on a daily basis. I love using it on a daily basis. Is the problems I have in Linux are nothing compared to what they are in Windows. Windows makes you want to pull your hair out. At least for me it does. Linux, on the other hand, I don't know. The problems I have are way more complicated, and they're not that often. They're normally ones that I've created. To where in Windows, it's a lot of times the operating system has created that problem. Oh my goodness, don't get me started on Windows updates. That causes a major source of issues all the time. Anyway, let's listen to some of the Q&A questions here.
How did you support yourself through all these years? You were playing with computers. How are you surviving?
Well, one of the advantages of Finland is, well, first the disadvantage of Finland is that if I was here in shorts and a t-shirt in September in Finland, I'd be freezing. But there are advantages. And one of them is actually that university, at a good university, I think I paid $50 a year. And that was actually for extended health care, which means that you can afford to goof off. I spent 8.5 years at Helsinki University. If you spend 8.5 years the only thing I got for it was actually a master's, right? I got a few PhD later on, but those were the honorary kind, right? So 8.5 years for a master's. If you did that at Stanford, you'd be kicked out so fast, or your dad would have to be really rich, right? But if you pay $50 a year and the state actually gives you money to live on, well, you get a student loan with basically 0% interest rate. You can afford to goof off. You can afford to do things that aren't actually really important for your education. It turned out that Linux was really important for my education, but I mean, that you couldn't tell until later. And yes, I lived with my parents until an embarrassingly late point in my time, so that also helps, right?
I hate to rehash the whole microkernel thing, but how do you feel about it now, and do you think it could ever go that way?
Here we go again.
Microkernels. I used to be a lot more polite about microkernels than I am these days. I used to think that microkernels had kind of an inherent beauty, and I think that's what confused a lot of people. A lot of people thought that microkernels were cute and beautiful. And my current thinking on microkernels is that Unix is actually a microkernel. It does everything that should sanely be done in kernel space, and everything that shouldn't sanely be done in kernel space, it does in user-level servers. And that's one level of microkernels. The problem with going much further than that is that, yes, you simplify the pieces, but what you don't do is you do not simplify the system. Quite the reverse. What happens in a microkernel is, because you simplify the pieces, you now have a lot of interaction between pieces, and they're actually fairly fundamentally, they tend to be asynchronous interactions between pieces if you want to have any good performance at all, right? Which means that you have asynchronous communication between hundreds of different pieces, and you've just made your life living hell, right? Which is the fundamental problem of microkernels, that the reason for their existence, namely simplicity, isn't actually true. And then you also find that when you add a lot of communication, you slow down the problem space. Surprise, surprise. And
Shocker. More data
so
going
to
across the
counteract
bus.
that, you actually make the pieces more complicated again in order to get back the performance you lost. Now, so this is why I think, for example, that all the traditional microkernels are just stupid. That doesn't mean that distributed systems are necessarily stupid. There's two things here, and sometimes people seem to be equating microkernels with distributed systems. It's perfectly sane to have a real kernel on lots of machines and then take communication where you have to take communication, namely between the machines. There you can't avoid it, right? Well, you can avoid it by having SMP and NUMA, and actually you should take SMP and NUMA as far as you can, but at some point you just can't go any further. And when you have to take communication, then you do it. But you communicate as little as possible until that point. That's my strong opinion, and I think that computer science, when it came to operating system, did most of what should be done in the 60s, and everything else was mental masturbation, right? So,
Well, don't like that, but
Since you mentioned hating the VAX, what do you think about the current VAX port of Linux?
I didn't hate the VAX hardware. I hated VMS. Now, I actually know people who like VMS and thinks that VMS is a really well-designed system.
would they like VMS?
I think the point where I realized that I hated VMS was when I tried to figure out what the size of a file was. And I couldn't, right? I could figure out how many blocks it took on the disk. I knew it had a size because when I actually tried to print the file out, I didn't get it at block boundaries, right? But if you could write dir/size and it would give you the size of block. I had to write a C program to figure out what the size of some of my projects were.
Yeah, I like
where I realized,
virtual machines, but VMS is not quite the same thing.
For humans. Right? So, I don't know. Maybe
It's not what we know as virtual machines
other
today.
than from a purely sentimental reason. I mean, sentimental reasons I can understand. But there was one person who actually raised his hand, right? Okay, I'm sorry, I just made two enemies for life. But I do not like VMS. So.
And see, like the closed captioning is not putting that correctly. All three letters are capitalized, VMS, because that's actually the operating system's name. It's not a virtual machine. It's a mainframe operating system, and you're accessing it through basically a Weiss type terminal. In that sense, it's similar to a virtual interface, but not quite the same thing as virtual machine. I know you're just kidding, but I do love virtual machines. I love playing with VirtualBox all the time. Matter of fact, that's how I use to check out versions of Linux. I'll go to, matter of fact, like one of the sites here that I like going to is right here, OS Boxes. This is an awesome website. If you just want to play around with a version of Linux, you can download a fully installed version of Linux and run it in a thing called VirtualBox. You can start it up, and also the VMware as well, another one, but and like, for example, if I wanted to check out Elementary OS, I could go to their website, or I could download a VirtualBox image of Elementary OS, which the latest version they have is 6.0, and I believe the latest version that's out is 7.0. But you could download it. There's even the information on how to log in, username and password for it, When you bring up the operating system, it allows you to play with it and so forth. VMs are awesome, I think. It's like running a computer inside of a window. But a VMS was never good, in my opinion. He's not kidding. To just do simple things that you're used to doing in an operating system, even in Unix, the commands just aren't easy or non-existent. It's just not something you can do.
I actually saw you talk, if you haven't spoken for 2 years, and I saw you talk at one of your more recent ones, I asked you a question then in front of the audience, and that was kernel-level clustering. Now, at the time, you were buried in the SMP stuff, but the answer you gave 2 answers ago sounds like you've been thinking about that kind of thing a lot more recently.
One thing that's been very interesting about Linux is how the whole project has kind of grown up. And I remember it must be like 6, 7 years ago when people asked me whether Linux would ever support SMP. And I said, yeah, we could, but it doesn't seem to make any sense that all the hardware is too expensive and the kind of people who are using Linux aren't interested, right? And I was very, very, very wrong, obviously. And that's good, because SMP ended up being one of the most interesting projects and a reason for a large rewrite of a lot of stuff in the kernel. And clustering still isn't really interesting. It doesn't seem to be there today. And at the same time, there are enough people who disagree with me, and hardware and the kind of people who use Linux has changed. So I still suspect that on a kernel level, we'll want to avoid it as far as possible and push most of the problems into user space.
I just realized that if you don't know what SMP is, it's actually, for lack of an easy word, I mean, it stands for symmetric multiprocessing, but basically it's what allows the processor via the kernel to be able to do more than one process at a time.
At the same time, some amount of kernel support,
simply put,
giving a better single system image is clearly something that will be done. I mean, there are already projects like Beowulf already has support for a more single system image look through kernel.
Yeah, he's talking about Beowulf, which Beowulf is a version of Linux, I believe, that does what's called clustering. It allows you to take multiple computers all running Beowulf Linux and treat them like one gigantic computer. I think it's called Beowulf. It also may not show up here. All right, let me do this. Yeah, there we go. This is an example of a Beowulf cluster. Cluster is basically a series of computers that are all kind of connected together in a cluster of networking that allows them to function as one gigantic supercomputer. It's used in a lot of things like nowadays you'd find it primarily in things like rendering of CGI stuff, like for example DreamWorks, which runs Linux, because like for example Shrek, the movie Shrek, was actually back in the day when it was created, it was the first version, first CGI movie ever solely 100% created using Linux. And at that time, DreamWorks had 80 Red Hat Linux servers all tied into a cluster that was doing their rendering. That was their rendering farm. I don't want to get into all what rendering is and everything, but nevertheless, this is kind of what clustering is. That's what he's talking about here with Beowulf Linux.
Support. At the same time, that's certainly not the kind of cluster that most people think about. So I'm not directly involved in it. There's a number of projects doing it. There's Beowulf, there's Mossix, there's a lot of these things. It's not mainstream enough yet to know who's going to be the winner and what's the best approach, and there may be multiple approaches. But it looks like in a few years we'll certainly have that as the standard kernel instead of having that as like research projects outside the standard kernel. Somebody on this side? Okay, one there.
Normally when software people get together and the subject of the x86 architecture comes up, they tend to quarrel, or they tend to try to outdo each other with their complaints. Your comments were almost complimentary to some technical aspects of the 386. I agree with you, but I'm wondering if you've alienated any of your friends or family by coming to its defense.
I don't know. When you come from a 68K background, the 386 looks so baroque. And I used to, I mean, and I've seen some of the really baroque details. I mean, I work for a company which makes a clone of that, and I thought it was baroque before. And now I'm convinced, I mean, some of the stuff a 386 actually does is, I mean, these guys were on drugs. At least part of the time, if not always, right? But at the same time, the fact is that I'm...
And by the way, most people don't realize this, but when you're talking about a 386 or the x86 family, you're talking all the way up into the latest Intel processors that are currently out today, or AMD processors that are currently out today. They all have their roots in this x86 architecture. It's how the processor interacts with the hardware bus on the motherboard. It's how it interacts with the operating system. That's why, for example, you cannot take a current version of Mac OS, for example, that's on their Silicon Macs and run them on an x86 Mac, because that processor family is different. It's physically, and when I say physical, I mean the hardware itself is different. It's hardwired differently. So the operating system itself has to connect to it in a different way as well. Has to be written from the kernel on up, completely different. And actually, Apple just returned to their roots, because Mac operating systems used to be RISC-based because the hardware they ran on was RISC-based. It wasn't until Mac OS X version 10 that they came out with a Power PC, or basically a Mac that came out with two different processors in it, one for x86 and one for RISC-based. And then eventually they made their operating system 100% x86 based, which is Mac OS X, and now they've gone back to being RISC based. So for example, if I was to install a version of Linux on a silicon based Mac, like an M1, like an Apple MacBook Pro M1 or an M2, I would have to get a RISC based version of Linux. It wouldn't run. The x86 version, the version I'm running right now, would not run because it's made for a PC. Just explaining the simple basics of architecture and hardware architecture. That's what he's talking about here.
That I'm really impressed with what you can actually do with this strange architecture. And most of the time these days I program at a high enough level that I don't care. Segmentation is still there, but you can just ignore it if you just turn everything flat, which everybody does these days. So most of the Baroque details you can ignore, and the things you can't ignore is the fact that they're the fastest CPUs on the planet right now, and they're the cheapest ones too, which is I mean, that's not something I'm going to argue against.
Can I get you to talk on the subject?
All right, I think we're going to end it there. You can watch the rest of these questions if you really want to. If you're a technical geek like me, I've already watched all this before. But nevertheless, I just thought this was a appropriate subject from a Linux lover like me, a Linux loving penguin named Whataboutbob, that I felt like I needed to, on Linus Torvalds Birthday, talk about Linux. So, anyway, I will leave you with this last thought of the day before I leave you. It's called the verse of the day. This is on K-Love, and I wanted to share this verse with you. Psalm 16:11 in the New Living Translation, it says, "You will show me the way of life," talking about God. You will show me the way of life, granting me the joy of your presence and the pleasures of living with you forever. Notice it doesn't say anywhere about living with the pleasures of earth, but the pleasures of living with God in his presence. So there you go. That's the verse of the day. And I hope you found this conversation about Linux maybe a little bit interesting. A little bit, I know some of it can be a little dry and some of it can be a little heady and over your head, maybe, if you're not a geek like I am, that understands at the hardware and operating system level things that are going on. I kind of have that type of background as well, although I didn't go into software development like Linus Torvalds did. I kind of stuck with the hardware side of things and went toward networking and things. But I know enough to be dangerous in that realm about kernel programming to kind of understand what he's talking about. And I think it's good that for me personally, to remind myself of the humble beginnings of an operating system that I love and that I use on a regular basis, one way or another. So anyway, and if I haven't told you in a while, Merry Christmas. And as usual, this is the crazy little Christmas Linux penguin named Whataboutbob. And I'm going to head out, and next week will be the New Year's special, because we got the New Year's coming up, 2024, and 2024 is going to be an interesting thing. And as always, the Linux community always asks the same question every year: is 2024 going to be the year of the Linux desktop? Personally, I don't think so. It never really has been. But Linux has found its niche. It's everywhere else, just not on someone's home computer a lot. The vast majority of people, maybe about 3% of the world's population, actually use Linux on a daily basis. The rest of the world is still Microsoft and Apple. It's just the way it is. Anyway, yeah. See, like, for example, Tracy, if I had to guess, you're probably at work and you're on Windows. Even though you do enjoy using Linux from time to time. For me, if I had my choice, then I'd be in Linux all the time. Unfortunately, there's some things I have to do that I have no other option, but I have to be in Windows for. So it is what it is. I'm a little Linux penguin living in a Windows world. So anyway, I will leave you with those thoughts, and I'm out of here. You guys have a good rest of your year of 2023. The next time I see you will be in 2024. So Merry Christmas, or Merry Fishmas, and a Happy Slappy Fish New Year. There you go. Later, peeps.